Hello and welcome back. Today what we're going to do is we are going to talk about the midpoint formula. So we're going to start off by talking about it between two given points on a number line, and then we're going to expand on that to be able to find the midpoint between 2 points on the coordinate plane, right, working in more dimensions. So first off, we've got this number line here, right? We've got a dot at 3 and a dot at 9. Right? And our very first thing that we're going to ask ourselves is how far apart are those 2 points? Right? You might be thinking like, oh, yeah, that's not so hard. Right? You just know that 3 and 9 are 6 spaces apart. You could also 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bounce on between them and figure out that it's 6 that way as well. All right, so those 2 points are 6 spaces apart. If I wanted to find that value mathematically, what I could do, right, is I could say, oh yeah, it's 9 minus 3, which does give me 6, right? You're taking one value and subtracting the other, right? If we're trying to figure out what point is halfway between those 2 points, right, we need to be the same distance from each one. So one way that we could do that is we could hop and say like, oh yeah, let's hop 1 from the 3, 1 from the 9. We're still not in the middle. Let's keep going, right? 1 from the 3, 1 from the 9, 1 from the 3, and 1 from the 9. I know that might seem a little bit much for something where we could see that it's at 6, right? But that's one way that we could get that answer, right? So the point that's halfway between those is 6, right? I do want to mention that the fact there's 6 spaces apart and the fact that the midpoint is 6 are not really related. They just happen to work out that way here. If we're trying to figure out how far that midpoint is from each original point, we just take a look at how many spaces we had to jump from each. So I had to do 3 jumps in red, 3 jumps in blue. Right? It's 3 spaces away from each one of those original points. Okay. Now I've got a vertical number line way over to the right, right? Where there's a dot up at 2, there's a dot down at -4. So if I'm trying to figure out how far apart those 2 points are, right, it might be a little bit weirder in your brain to figure out. What we can always do is we can just figure out how many hops it takes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Right, so those are also, 6 spaces apart. All right, let's clean that up a little bit. If I wanted to figure this value out mathematically, right, again, what we need to do is we need to take one value and subtract the other one. So 2 minus -4. When I've got minus a negative like that, what we can do is we can turn that into one big old plus sign, right? And what we're going to get is that 2 plus 4 is 6. Those are 6 spaces apart, which is what we found out by doing the little hops. If we wanted to figure out which point is halfway between them, right, again, we can do the same thing we did on the first one. We can hop, let's say twice from there. We can hop up twice from -4. Let's do one more hop there in the blue. We'll do one more hop there in the red. And so what we're going to find is that our middle point there is at -1. Trying to figure out how far that midpoint is from each original point, right? Same thing. We can do it with the number of hops we had to take from each side, which is just 3 again, right? So lots of 6s and 3s floating around. So this is going to lead us into talking about how to find the midpoint a little bit more easily when we're working on a number line. And the way we're going to do that is we are going to take A plus B and divide it by 2. Right? So we're not really, doing anything more than taking one number, adding the other one, and then dividing by 2. If I take a look back at what I had, right, we found our distance between the points mathematically. If I divided that by 2, I'm going to get how far away it is, right? If I also take the original coordinates, right, 9 and 3, if I took 9 plus 3 and divided it by 2, 9 plus 3 is 12, and 12 divided by 2 is 6, right? That's another way we can get that midpoint. It would also work for these 2 numbers down here, 2 and -4. If I say, oh yeah, 2 plus -4, all divided by 2, right? 2 plus -4, is -2. If I take -2 and divide it by 2, I end up at -1, right? So I know I've got a lot on the screen right now. Let's kind of clean it up a little bit. Right, but what we can do is we can just add one number plus the other number, divide it by 2, and that's how far it is between them. So when we're working on graphs, right, where we're working in more than just one dimension, right, we have 2 dimensions here, we have a height and a length, it gets a little bit trickier, you might be thinking like, oh yeah, no, well, it looks like it lines up pretty well, right? We could just hop 1, 2, 1, 2, right? But unfortunately, that doesn't usually work out so well for graphs. Spoiler alert, it would work out just fine for this one because everything lines up really, really nicely, but we can do better than that, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to treat this in two parts, right? So we're going to first figure out the horizontal part with the x's, right? And we're going to use that midpoint formula that we have right up top there, right? So if I'm taking a look at those 2 points, 3, -4, and 9, 2, right? The 3 and the 9 are the x's, right? I gave them a little x1 and x2 just to kind of tell them apart, just like we would do with slope or distance, right? And then the other numbers, the -4 and the 2, are the y's. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit there. To figure out the midpoint for the x's, I'm just going to take one of those x's, add the other one, and divide by 2. All right, so in this case, that's going to be 3 plus 9 divided all by 2. All right, so 3 plus 9 is 12. 12 divided by 2 is 6. All right, so that's going to be the x of our midpoint. The other part that we need to do is figure out the vertical part. Right, and that's going to be working with the y's. So same deal, right? We're going to take one of the y's, -4. We're going to add the other y, which was 2, and we're going to divide it all by 2. All right, so -4 plus 2 is -2. -2 divided by 2 is -1. And again, that's going to give us the y of our midpoint. So at the end of all this, right, we have a midpoint. It's going to be at 6, -1. Those are the coordinates of that midpoint. So if we have a graph, we might as well use it, right? Let's figure out where 6, -1 would be, right? Let's choose a different color just so it stands out a little better. All right, so 6, -1 would be right over here. And that sure looks like a midpoint to me, right? It looks like it's equal distance from each of those other two, right? So hopefully that doesn't seem so bad, right? It's just a little bit of adding, divide by 2, and then you're done, right? So let's flip on to the next side of this, talk about the actual midpoint formula, right? The whole thing that we're going to use for our graphing coordinates. So the midpoint formula is going to look something like this. And it's going to look scary, but it's not actually going to be all that bad because we actually just did the whole thing. So we're going to have a big set of parentheses, and then up first is x1 plus x2, all divided by 2. And actually, so I know that sometimes it's helpful to color code things, so let's go ahead and do that. All right, so we got a comma, and then we're going to have y1 plus y2, all divided by 2, and then close our parentheses. Right, so I know it doesn't really look like a formula, right? It doesn't have an equal sign anywhere in there, right? But what I'm going to do here is I'm taking the coordinates from the 2 points I have, and I'm plugging them in just like we did, right? This first piece, that's the horizontal chunk with the x's. This second piece over here is the vertical chunk with the y's, right? We just did both of those steps, but if we kind of group it all together like this, it's all in one just easy to use thing. The one thing I want to make sure to mention is be careful not to forget any negatives on your values, right? If you're plugging in something negative for y2 or x1 or whatever, make sure that if it's a negative that you have that negative there because that will change things. All right, so let's give it a go. Right, so just like with slope, what I might suggest doing first is to label your 2 points, right? Call this first one x1, y1, call the second one x2, y2. Doesn't really matter which one you call the first one or the second one, right? But labels are kind of nice. If you kind of lose your way halfway through the problem, it'll be a little bit easier to recover. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it up just like in that formula above, right? I can even write out the skeleton for it if you're somebody that likes to, start it off that way. So if I just go ahead and do that, all I need to do now is just drop my numbers in there, right? If I'm looking at the first chunk on the left, it's x1 plus x2. x1 is labeled as 3. x2 is labeled as 11. Then we got to do the same thing for the y's in that second piece. y1 is 7. y2 is 3. Right? After that, it's just a matter of going through it, right? Simplifying things down. So if I have 3 plus 11 in that first chunk, 3 plus 11 is 14. The second chunk, 7 plus 3, is going to give us 10. All right, so I'm kind of doing both parts at the same time, one thing at a time. If we keep on going, right, 14 divided by 2 is 7. 10 divided by 2 is 5. And then we're done, right? The midpoint between those two coordinates is 7, 5. That's all we're looking for, all right? So I'd like you to try out the next one. See how it goes, right? So hopefully, if you haven't yet, try pausing here, give it a go. Start by labeling and then plug everything in. And if you have tried it by now, excelente, right? I'm going to start off the same way. I'm going to label my x1, y1 and my x2, y2. Right. After that, I'm just going to set up my midpoint formula. Oops, and let's make that a little bit bolder so everything a little bit easier to see. All right, and again, you can set up the skeleton just like I'm doing if that seems to help you out at all. Right. I like it because then you just got to plug the numbers in and you're good. So when I'm plugging in x1, I again want to make sure I grab that negative with that 2. When I'm plugging in x2, it's just regular old 7. Right. For the y's, we've got -5 and -1. Okay. So for this first chunk, right, -2 plus 7, right? If I was at -2 and I added 7, I'm now at +5. For the second piece, if I was at -5 and I added on a -1, right, what's really going on there is that we're sort of like subtracting that 1, right? So -5, take away 1 more, brings us to -6. Yeah. Last but not least, we got a little bit of division to do. Nothing too bad. 5, cut it in half, is going to give us 2.5. -6 divided by 2 is -3. Right. So I know that in the past, if we had run into a fraction like 5/2, especially for slope, we would normally leave it alone, right? We would say, oh yeah, it's 5/2, no big deal. When we're working on midpoint, it does pay off to have an actual number at the end, right? So if we can turn it into a decimal like we can here, that is something that we should get in the habit of doing, because then I can graph that, right? I can think about where that is on a graph. Whereas if I left it as 5/2, it's maybe a little bit harder to think through in that way, right? So if you end up with a decimal when you're doing midpoint, perfectly fine. Okay. Try out the next one as well, right? Start by labeling, plug it all in, see what you get. So pause here, give it a go. All right, let's see how it went. I'm going to do it real quick right here. We got an x1, y1. We got an x2, y2. And then I'm going to set everything up. All right, again, setting up the skeleton for everything. And that way I can just drop my numbers in. So for the x's, I got 12 and -19. For the y's, I've got -2 and 5. Okay. Moving our way forward, 12 plus -19 is kind of the same as 12 minus 19. So we're going to get -7/2. And as for the second chunk, -2 plus 5 is going to give us 3, which still needs to be divided by 2. So let's do that divided by 2 piece, right? That last step. -7, cut it in half, is -3.5. 3, cut it in half, is 1.5. Right? So what we're finding here is that, they both came out as decimals, but that's okay, right? We've been kind of shied away from decimals, especially when we're graphing, because they kind of suck sometimes. Like you can't really count things out too well. But if it's a 0.5, right, we can kind of guesstimate where that is. It should be pretty close, right? So again, if we end up with a decimal, that is an okay thing. Okay. So this last one is a little bit of a challenging problem, right? So a line segment has one endpoint at 6, -5, and a midpoint at 1, -1. Right? We want to find the other endpoint. Right? So what I'm going to do first is I have this graph that I put in over here. Let's graph those 2 points and see what we're working with, just to kind of get a visual on it. So 6, -5 is going to be right down over there. All right. I know that a lot of times when these print out, the graph doesn't come through as well, so I'm sorry about that. If you're able to get it somewhere around the right spot, perfectly fine. All right, so again, that's the point 6, -5. Our midpoint is at 1, -1. right? So that's going to be right there. Oops. All right, so again, the red point is an end point of our line segment. The blue point is our midpoint. So that means that our other end point is going to be somewhere maybe in like this vicinity over here is what we're looking for, right? Because that midpoint should be halfway between two red points at the end of this. So how can we figure that out, right? That's kind of the tricky piece here. So let's think back to what we were working on kind of, as our first example of all this on the front side of this. We worked with a horizontal piece and then a vertical piece with our midpoint formula. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at just the x's first. All right, so with the x's, right, I'm going to think through what my midpoint formula would look like. So my x that I have is 6. So normally I'd say 6 plus the other x, right, and then divide it all by 2, right? When I go through that process, that's going to give me the x coordinate of my midpoint, right? Which in this case, we already know is 1. Right? So we can set ourselves up with a little equation like this. We can do a little bit of solving, and then it'll help us figure out what that other coordinate should be. Right? So to solve this out, right, I need to get rid of that divided by 2 piece all along the bottom. To undo division by 2, I multiply everything by 2. Right? So as I go to my next step, right, I'm going to say, all right, everything times 2. Right? After I do that, it's going to look something like this. 6 plus that missing coordinate we need is equal to 2. Right? After that, we just subtract 6 from both sides. Right? We'll have that missing coordinate again. And then on the other side, 2 minus 6 is negative 4. Right? So when I'm trying to, figure out that other endpoint, I now know that the x part of it is negative 4. Right? So we'll also do the y piece, but for a second, I want to scroll back to the graph. My x2 is negative 4, so that's kind of narrowing down that range we were looking at, right? We had that red circle where it was like, oh yeah, it's somewhere over here. I now know that my other midpoint is going to be somewhere where the x is negative 4, right? Somewhere in that chunk there. All right, let's do the same thing for the y's. All right, so for the y's, same deal, right? I got to think through what it would look like if I was setting this up for a midpoint. I would have negative 5, and then I would be adding on the other coordinate, right? And I'd be dividing everything by 2. When I worked through that, I would get the y part of our midpoint, which we already know is negative 1. Right? So it's the same deal as the last time, right? I need to undo that divided by 2 piece. I'm going to multiply everything by 2, just like before. We're going to have negative 5 plus that missing y piece equals negative 2. Last but not least, we'll add 5 to each side to get rid of that. Get that y2 all by itself so we can figure out what it is. And then negative 2 plus 5 is 3. Okay, so now that we know that our y piece is up at 3, we're just looking for where those two things meet, right? That's going to be the coordinates of that other endpoint we need. So it's going to be at negative 4, comma 3. If I put that down, negative 4, comma 3, and I take a look at my graph, right, it sure does seem like that's a pretty good midpoint, right? If you took a ruler, you could measure it out and see like, oh yeah, that is pretty darn close, So again, this is probably this is the most complicated that these types of midpoint problems will get, is like find the missing value given the endpoint and the midpoint, right? But if you're feeling okay about what we were doing up here with these other ones, you should be okay. So don't worry too much. Still give these ones a shot, right? They're a good challenge, but don't stress yourself out more than you need to. All right, so that's it for this one. Hope it was pretty short. I didn't really keep a timer. And I will talk to you next time. See ya.